You were very much looking forward to this iOS 7 update. Did it live up? Did it exceed your expectations?
I think it did marginally exceed, and the reason why, there's actually substance behind the update to iOS. It's not just some new icons, and the reality is that the amount of touch points that people have with these mobile devices is much more important than the hardware itself. And so, from my perspective, looking at what the substance of some of the changes to iOS were, exceeded where I was at. And I think ultimately is that consumers, when they actually get a chance to play around with this, are going to realize that this is actually a pretty big day today.
Brian, how about you? Do you think it's as good as it needs to be?
You know, it will always improve, but, you know, like Tim Cook called it, the biggest update since the original iPhone. And I think the aesthetics around it were much better than I would have thought. You know, there had been some photos out on the web that didn't give it justice. And there's a lot of new aesthetics here that really I think people are going to be impressed with.
The question is, can Apple regain sort of design leadership in software? Gene, do you think this puts Apple back at the top?
Yeah, it does put them back at the top in terms of for mobile OS. You know, they're going to have some form of a lead, whether it's a year or something like this. Essentially what they've done is taken some of the elements that are already out there with some of these other phones and refined them even better. So the challenge, though, with Apple, in Apple's case, is that they don't do this very often. As John was talking about, they play the long game, and so you don't have these big changes every year. So good news for Apple and Apple iPhone owners is you get a bump up, but it's going to be important for Apple to keep the heat on. They can't back off a year from now.
John, what are you hearing out there from users, from developers, in terms of what they want and in terms of whether or not this is good enough?
I think that the developers want ways to just take some of the cool stuff that, whether it's an Apple or Google, are offering and integrate it into what they're doing. And I think that, you know, when you listen to the crowd reaction, for example, to the various features, the multitasking, for example, that you can do with iOS 7, I think that's been a common beef with Apple is, you know, you do one thing at a time. You think about another company, BlackBerry, which recently unveiled their new phones and highlighted the fact that you can be doing all this multitasking as a reason to buy a BlackBerry and not an iPhone. I think that does, though, leave some questions. Apple didn't say too much about its music streaming service. I know that some of the people we spoke to here would be very hungry to really integrate that into what they're doing, and Apple was very cautious about what they said on that front.
Let's talk a bit more about the music streaming service now. Brian, I want to bring you back in here. You know, they didn't give a ton of details, but from what you heard, how meaningful is this new service?
You know, I think it keeps them in the game. You know, more and more younger people are moving to streaming music online, and I think this is a piece of the puzzle they didn't have. They had to have it. People anticipated it. They got the deals wrapped up with the labels and announced it, and I think it's important.
Gene, your thoughts? Is Apple just playing catch-up here, or can they be a real significant player in this market?
Well, they can be a player, but the music market isn't really a good market unless you're some of the content owners. And so in Apple's case, let's just say that they grow a business to be equal to the size of Pandora's expectations for next year. That would add about 0.5% to Apple's revenue. So keep in mind, a home run product, just given the dynamics of how this business works, is really doesn't even measure up. But an important feature that they had to integrate to stay competitive. You
know, how big, Brian, do you think Apple can be in streaming radio?
I think, you know, again, back to what Eugene said, I think this is a very important part of the digital ecosystem and keeping everything together. So I would think, you know, over time they will be the leader. I don't think that's a question. But it's more important just to keep everyone interested in their ecosystem, and that's what really this is all about.
And speaking about that ecosystem, there had been some hope that Apple would open up the ecosystem to developers. Did you see any hints of that, Gene?
You know, we didn't see much on that. Eventually, it's going to happen. I mean, they're moving down that path. It's one of the products that's coming. We all know a lot about it in the television side of things, and eventually they'll have an app store for TV. Didn't hear about it today, but I would say in the next 6 to 9 months we'll hear a lot more about that.
And we're going to talk about TV a little bit more after the break. But Brian, I want to ask you, are the changes that you saw today enough to keep Apple's competitors at bay for a while, or is this is a war?
Well, it's still a war. But what I'm excited about is it just sets the stage for a major product cycle. We didn't have an event for 8 months. We had this event, and I think we're going to have a series of them into the fall, into early 2014. This is a new product cycle, and that's why investors should be excited.